our look at World War I, which we know was a dramatic change of pace for the United States, a completely different reaction from the United States. The first time the United States had gotten involved in an overseas conflict, we saw the first time that a sitting president actually went to Europe personally to conduct business with European leaders, and the United States attempting to embrace a much bigger role in the world. You know, that was something that Wilson felt really passionate about and really felt like the United States needed to take on a leadership role in the post-war world, that he had this grand vision of expanded democracy and a world where there was more transparency, more cooperation, and that the United States would kind of be leading the way through that whole thing. But we also know that Wilson's vision of a post-war world, at least as far as how the United States would fit into it, did a lot of other Americans share that same vision? Not at all. We know that most Republican senators and representatives and leaders did not. They were concerned about the United States getting involved in conflicts that they had no business in, and Congress's power being overtaken by the League of Nations and those kind of things. So what we see in the decade following World War I is almost, in some ways, kind of a total opposite of what some like Wilson had envisioned. And instead of the United States being engaged and kind of leading the way as far as promoting democracy and those sorts of things, we see the United States very much turning inward throughout the 1920s, returning to that historical isolationism. It still doesn't look the same. It's not the same kind of isolationism you saw prior to World War I, mainly for economic reasons, but very much a turning inward, shunning international commitments, not wanting to be involved in those sorts of things, denouncing foreign ideas, trying to get away from foreign influence, trying to diminish foreign influence. We're going to see in the 1920s, both a lot of very exciting changes and a lot of things that a lot of people are going to really be excited about, and ways that life is going to be more vibrant, and we're going to see all kinds of new cultural changes. We're going to see a massive economic explosion, a huge economic boom in which a lot of people have a much greater increased standard of living, new kinds of things to do for fun. It's a changing culture. The 1920s is really an interesting time for a lot of reasons. It gets that name, the Roaring 20s, for a lot of reasons. There's all kinds of new music, and there's other new entertainment with the beginnings of movies and jazz music and all that sort of stuff. But it is also politically and culturally a very isolating kind of time in some ways, because Americans are very much turning inward and wanting to get back to isolationism, wanting to focus on things that were, they deemed as American and pure, and shunning everything else, trying to turn away and trying to diminish or even get rid of things that a lot of folks deemed as un-American and things like that. So that happens in lots of different ways. But we're going to see all kinds of things throughout this chapter that are new, that have a big impact on the economy, that have a big impact on the culture, new technologies, new leisure activities, more entertainment. But today, we're going to look at the political climate, which could be a tricky thing. And people would find, people of certain persuasions, people of certain beliefs would find themselves in a situation where they probably didn't want to say too much about some of those beliefs and things like that. So, as I've already kind of hinted, the United States, Americans, generally speaking, on the whole, very much turning inward in the 1920s, shunning things that were different, shunning things that seemed un-American, that seemed radical. And now when it comes to political radicalism, when it came to really extreme political ideas, more left-wing political ideas, things like socialism, things like communism, all those sorts of things, how had Americans typically in the past responded to those kind of ideals? Were they really popular or not really popular? Not really popular. We've already talked before about how Americans, generally speaking, was very nervous, very wary of those kinds of radical ideas. We talked about how that was one of the big struggles of the labor movement. In the Gilded Age was that association with radicalism and the fear that it was an attempt by radicals socialists and communists and others, anarchists, to come and take over, and then there'd be violence and all those sorts of things. So we know that historically that has always been a difficult path for those sorts of groups. But in the 1920s, we see this paranoia and this fear of radical ideas extremely heightened for a number of reasons. One, if you remember, one of the last things we talked about at the end of World War I, during World War I, the labor movement actually gained a lot. There were a lot of good things going for the labor movement during World War I. Why was that? Why was the labor movement, or laborers, let's just say laborers, getting a lot of the things that they hoped for during the war? Yes?
The U.S. government wanted protection for the war to go fast, so they wanted to settle all the strikes and everything. So they would get what they needed.
Yes, we had the government kind of on their side at that point because they didn't want things to slow down. But once the war was over, they no longer have that. They no longer have the government kind of on their side. And remember that things kind of stalled out, that wages weren't increasing. And so we saw a number of strikes. We talked about a few of those. Strikes right there in 1919, moving into 1920 as World War I ended. A lot of those got really, really ugly. We also saw racial violence. The Tulsa Massacre being probably certainly the worst and most extreme case of that. And there were thousands. There were thousands of strikes in 1919, 1920. It was just unbelievable to a lot of people. I mean, something like somewhere between maybe 3,500 to 4,000 strikes within about a 12-month period, and some of them were violent. And so all those labor strikes and those race riots toward the end of the war it heightens that fear again, that fear of radicalism, that fear that workers were radicals, the fear that workers wanted violence, that there was going to be like a workers' revolution, that there were these tensions were going to spill over into anarchy and chaos. People started to get really worried about that because of all those things. Another thing that really heightens people's fear of radical ideas and heightens people's fear of some kind of a violent incident, of something, a really un-American conspiracy going on here, has to do with something going on way, way far away, and that, of course, is the Bolshevik Revolution that was occurring in what was formerly Russia. Now, we kind of mentioned a little bit the Russian Revolution, which really had been brewing for decades, but officially somewhere around 1917, you have the, overthrow of the Tsar. That's really all we talked about. Well, after that, when they overthrow, the incredibly autocratic Tsarist regime, there was hope, as we talked about, that Russia might become democratic. There was movement in that country to embrace more democratic reforms and all those sorts of things. And this is, of course, more incredibly complicated than I'm talking about here. But what eventually happens, instead of Russia becoming a democracy, eventually you get a civil war going on in Russia for a couple of years, ultimately resulting in people called the Bolsheviks coming to power. The Bolsheviks, let's just call them, for lack of a better word, communists. We're talking about the communist takeover of Russia, and Russia becomes no longer Russia, but the Soviet Union, as I'm sure you know, and we'll call them the Soviet Union from here on until the end of the Cold War in the 80s. So we have here a communist takeover, and quite a violent one, and a very ugly civil war and a very ugly conflict that ultimately results in Russia, one of the largest countries, falling to communism. And so what this means for the United States, although it doesn't have anything to do with the United States, immediately, what it does mean and what it does do is, it makes that fear of communism and that fear of radical ideas and the fear of radical violence and all of those things, it makes it seem a lot more real. This seems a lot more plausible. It seems a lot more up in your face and realistic. If a large country like Russia, and the powerful Tsar could be overthrown and they could fall to this sort of idea, it really made people very worried, very paranoid, okay, that communism was around them, that there was a real threat of radical ideas. And so it just heightens all of that. It turns it from people seeing communism as maybe there's a couple of them scattered around. People become incredibly paranoid about that. So because of the communist takeover, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and it is now a communist nation, plus the fear over all of the labor disputes and race riots and strikes and all of those things, lead to, in the 1920s, something that we call the Red Scare. This is one of many things that characterizes the 1920s, and it's heightened particularly between 1919 and 1920, although it's not like it suddenly ends and people aren't afraid of these things anymore. The Red Scare, and we'll talk about this again, we'll see a second one happen in the 1950s. The Red Scare is this period of this heightened, practically irrational fear of communism, this hysterical nationwide fear and crusade against really extreme ideas, communism being one of them, but certainly not the only one. But this, communism, socialism, anarchism, any of those really left-wing political theories, which again, it's not new that people were, hesitant, suspicious of those kinds of things. But in this Red Scare, people are just incredibly fearful of it and really suspect that any of these radical ideas, that they're un-American, that they mean violence, and all of this stuff needs to be kind of weeded out. We need to silence, get rid of. And what this will lead to is not just, a fear and people being scared. This leads to, action. This leads to a lot of groups of people being targeted. This leads to a lot of people being targeted, being unfairly treated, and it leads to a lot of really blatant violations of civil liberties on the behalf of some groups because of the suspicion that they were radicals, the suspicion that they were bringing in all these ideas, that they wanted violence, that they were plotting revolutions, that they were plotting bombing, they were plotting attacks, all this sort of stuff. And it's called the Red Scare. In case you didn't know, red becomes synonymous with communism because in the Bolshevik Revolution, this whole civil war they had, you had the Bolsheviks, which were represented by the color red. That was the color they put on their flags and all that stuff. And then white, which was used by your more pro-democracy and all of that. So red just becomes associated with communism. And so when people talk about someone being red, they're calling them a communist. Anyway, like I said, this results in a lot of people just being totally convinced that there was a real communist threat, and there were people out there plotting all kinds of violent things. And there were some sporadic, there were militants in the country. It's not to say there weren't communists out there. There were. Not to say there weren't anarchists out there. There absolutely were. And there were some isolated bombings and some other violent events that were planned by some radical groups. Again, it gets totally blown out of proportion and gets, exaggerated into something that it most likely wasn't because of this paranoia. And again, it results in a lot of folks being unfairly treated. Throughout 1919 and 1920, there were multiple instances of raids on certain groups where their homes or their offices or whatever were broken into, and without probable cause, without warrants, things taken. There were hundreds of supposed radicals that were rounded up. Many, of course, were immigrants, and some of these people were, did profess some more radical beliefs. That doesn't necessarily mean they wanted to go out and kill everybody. And some of them weren't. Some of them, they were just immigrants. They were just people that maybe sometimes got associated with those kinds of ideas, even though they may have had nothing to do with that sorts of things. But there were all kinds of incidences of people being rounded up, things being confiscated, many of those people being deported without trial, without hearings, without sufficient evidence being presented. Again, not to say that there weren't some, folks out there that maybe wanted to do harm, or at least did profess those radical beliefs. But this ends up in a lot of people being, targeted and in some cases deported without, probable cause. Some of that was done on the national level. Some of it was on the state level. But this is one of the things that we'll see throughout the 1920s, in addition to the Red Scare. This is where the labor movement, which had gained a lot during World War I, they have to take several steps back throughout the 1920s. And this is one reason why, as people start to associate once again, and perhaps even in a more heightened way, associating labor activism with communism and labor activism with radical ideas, and that they're wanting to plot to take over. Again, the Bolshevik Revolution had a lot to do with that. People were afraid that those kind of ideas were coming to America. And it also contributes to just the overall attitude about immigrants. Okay, so it's all kind of snowballing and building upon similar ideas. So the Red Scare, again, is really just one facet of a rather, like I've already said, inward kind of culture in the 1920s, a rather sometimes paranoid culture of the 1920s. We see in the 1920s, this reactionary conservatism. So it's a move back towards conservatism in a lot of ways. We'll talk about that later with conservative approaches to the economy, things like that, going back to a little bit more of that laissez-faire kind of stuff, the reversal of a lot of progressive era reforms and things like that. But it is also reaction over, cultural exchanges. A lot of people, there was kind of a growing consensus amongst a lot of Americans that involvement in World War I had been either a mistake, some that might have said it was just an outright mistake, we shouldn't have done it, or others that may have said, okay, maybe we needed to do that, but we want to make sure that never happens again. We want to stay out of all those kinds of things. We want to stay out of foreign entanglements, and we want to, turn away from any kind of foreign ideas, whether they be political ideas or other kinds of influences as well. So we see again this turning inward and this trying to distance and trying to weed out things that seemed somehow un-American. One of the ways that this shows up was in the Red Scare, and another way that shows up, and you can see how these two things are very closely related, is in a resurgence of nativism throughout the 1920s. We've talked about that nativism phenomenon several times. What is nativism? Yes, and a belief that who should benefit from everything America had to offer? Native-born Americans. Okay, native-born Americans as opposed to who? Those immigrants. So nativism is an anti-immigrant movement. We saw that, of course, first spring up in the 1840s with, the first big wave of immigration that occurred in the United States, particularly against Irish immigrants. We talked about it earlier this year in the 1880s with the second big wave of immigration, particularly against those of Eastern European descent. And then we see it a third time in the 1920s. World War I had diminished European immigration, had slowed it down to almost nothing. As you can probably imagine, during the war years, there wasn't, the ability for a lot of immigration to take place. But as soon as the war's over, that increases significantly. So you're seeing a big upswing in immigration around 1919, 1920. And you can imagine that the situation in Europe meant that you had a lot of folks that wanted to escape the poverty and the turmoil and things like that were happening in the wake of World War I. So you see this big surge of immigration once again, and therefore this resurgence of nativism once again. And it's the same concerns and the same arguments and the same things that we've heard about always. So what are some of the reasons for the nativism, and what were some of the arguments of the nativists? Because it hasn't changed. What are their complaints?
Citizens' jobs.
Yeah, taking jobs, of course, driving wages down. That's, one of their old arguments, still the same thing. This whole, pollution of culture, that they're polluting, the Anglo-Saxon race, that they are polluting, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, that they're culturally inferior, their language, their religion, their food, that they're all poor, all this sort of stuff. The same things that nativists have been complaining about for decades, it's the exact same thing in the 1920s. One of the things, though, that we will see, and we'll talk about in just a moment, is that this time we will see actual national legislation passed for the purpose of trying to limit immigration, which is something we haven't quite seen just yet. Now, this fear of immigrants, and combine this also with the Red Scare. Okay, we have to think about these two things kind of in tandem with each other. Because there was a great concern, and perhaps maybe one way that nativism changes its tune a little bit in the 1920s, is this growing concern that immigrants are dangerous, that immigrants are not only taking jobs, and they're not only polluting, Anglo-Saxon values and all that kind of stuff, but they're all a bunch of radical, violent communists that want to overthrow America. There is a greater sense of that kind of danger. Not to say that that is brand new, but it's certainly more heightened by the 1920s, because again, this is happening in the context of the Red Scare. And the two things are feeding each other, you see. This fear, because a lot of these immigrants were coming from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, Some of them may not as many, but kind of sharing some ethnicities with Russia, and so the fear that they were bringing over those ideas as well. So it helps. The Red Scare helps generate some of this nativism as people are convinced that foreigners are troublemakers and that foreigners are coming into the country to cause problems and that they are going to cause violence and all these sorts of things. Again, this results, as we saw just a moment ago, with raids and deportations and things like that without cause, without trial, without hearings. Another particular example of the Red Scare and of nativism or people controversy that may have resulted from this involves the case of two Italian immigrants, Mensaco and Venzetti. We're going to look at this in just a moment. You're going to look at it first before I tell you about it. So this becomes quite a controversy, and I'm not going to tell you too much about it now because you're going to go ahead and look it up on your own, or what these two guys, what happened. But essentially, these are two immigrants. They get accused of a crime, and the outcome of that trial, the outcome of their whole situation, becomes quite the controversy, as and still remains so to this day, as to whether or not justice was truly served here, or if the outcome of this and the result had more to do with their status as immigrants and their political beliefs than it did actual evidence in this case. So we're going to pause here from the notes for just a moment. We're going to do that actually now, and then we'll come back to our notes just a little bit later. So we're not done with the notes yet, but just pause for a second. All right. Okay. So what is some of the criticism, concern? What were some of the inconsistencies here? What now? Okay. So we have that. What else? What other kind of things were fishy about the evidence or fishy about the trial?
All of the witnesses that were brought to the stand, most of their statements contradicted each other.
Yes. Contradictory statements. Yes.
It was in broad daylight, so somebody should have been able to see either one of them at the scene.
Yes.
Especially since Venzetti, he had like a huge mustache. Like I thought that would have stood out.
Yeah, maybe it looks someone might have more definitively.
Well, I mean, a lot of people have this kind of.
That is true.
They were both anarchists, and the judge was openly biased against anarchism.
Yes.
They both had alibis for the time of the murder.
They had alibis or stories as to where they were for all of this. So this is an example of something where there is still, debatable today, as you saw, but there was a general feeling that these two men were either innocent or, that there was a miscarriage of justice here, and that the reason that they were targeted and the reason that they didn't get a fair trial or the reason they were convicted was more because of what? They were foreigners because they were Italian immigrants, and they were anarchists. They were, radicals, which didn't necessarily mean that they were, advocating the overthrow of the government or anything. But again, there was some evidence, to suggest that maybe they were. But, this is one of the probably more infamous examples of how the Red Scare and how nativism, really caused in cases like this, perhaps a great deal of unfairness, a miscarriage of justice, and maybe the wrongful execution of people that may have been innocent. So that's again a general consensus of this whole case, is that at the very least they didn't get a fair trial, that there was evidence used that was unfair, and that if they had not been Italian immigrants, had they not been associated with radical ideas, that this whole thing might have turned out differently. Again, that's all hypothetical. We don't really know. But we can certainly look at it, at the very least, as an example of that fear and that hysteria and that sometimes irrational fear, causing people to be at least treated differently, if not outright unfairly. And while this is certainly the most high-profile case of something like that happening, we know that there were similar cases probably all over the place that maybe didn't get as much attention or as much publicity. So let's talk about some of the ways that nativism shows up in actual national policy. Again, it's not a new concept. We've seen attempts by nativists ever since the 1840s to try to diminish the rights of immigrants, to try to get people to not vote for candidates that weren't native born, and of course talking years later, for religious tests for holding office and things like that to try to diminish the influence of either Irish Catholics or whoever the case may be. Again, one of the ways that nativism in the 1920s takes on perhaps a little bit of a different tone is not just the proliferation of it and not just the sense that immigrants were dangerous, were political threats. We also see national laws passed to try to limit immigration. In the past, we have not seen this with the exception of the Chinese. The Chinese, of course, the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s had outright banned Chinese immigration, but there had been no attempt at a national scale to limit or pull back on immigration from other areas of the world. There are two laws passed in the 1920s that do this. The first is called the Emergency Immigration Act of 1921. What this law and the next one both do is they put in quotas. Okay, they put in immigration quotas. What do you think that means, an immigration quota? Basically a limit, a certain amount. And it really put it to a small amount. It really put a big limitation on the amount of immigrants that could come from any given country in a particular year, in a 12-month period. Now, I don't think it's important necessarily need to know the percentages and all this sort of stuff. But this law and this next one, I'll go ahead and put this next one up here because, again, they both essentially do the same thing. It's just the second one here, the Immigration Act of 1924, does it a little bit more strictly. Again, both of these laws are putting in quotas, and it's not just a blanket quota. It's not just saying, hey, we're going to accept 1 million people per year. This is based on country of origin. It is based on their nationality. It's based on where they're coming from. And the quotas are different depending on where the person is coming from. Okay, sometimes these are called emergency. Sometimes you'll see this one called the Emergency Quota Act, and sometimes one's called the National Origins Act, but they can use similar names. Again, I don't think it's necessarily important for you to know the percentages, but I think the first one here, it's something like in a given year, 3% of the population in the 1900 census of that particular nationality can come into the country. So that's going to change the numbers depending on the nationality that you're talking about. Particularly if you're talking about immigrants that it's not 18 minutes, it's further than that. It's something like, I can't remember the year again, I can look it up, but it's that part's not important. The thing is, it very much means that if it's groups of people from countries that were just beginning to come to the United States, those that were more from Southern Europe, those that were more from Eastern Europe, those groups of people are going to be much more heavily discriminated against because of these laws. Because the numbers that they're going off of, saying, okay, 3% of the population in this year, in that particular year, there weren't that many people in the United States from those countries, and that was kind of the whole idea. So this is far more forgiving and allows far more immigration from countries that were Western European, more from England, from France, from Ireland. That's where the larger numbers of people can come in. And it's going to bring to a screeching halt, or at least very much slow down immigration from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, those that were seen as more different, those that were seen as more of a threat. Both of these laws put much tighter restrictions on those groups.
Would you say that the Immigration Act of 1924 is basically just like a more strict version of the
Yes.
second one?
What the second one does is it tightens up the quotas even more. Okay, they both do quotas. They both use that same concept, but in 1924 they make it even smaller. They make it even more strict of a quota. So it is far less favorable to those newer immigrants, to those from Southern Europe, from Eastern Europe, and all of that. It reduces their numbers more than it does others. So this all but eliminates most Asian immigration to the United States. Again, the Chinese were already banned with certain, exceptions, things like that. Latin American immigrants, actually Canadian immigrants, are exempt from these laws, so it specifically targets European immigration. So it's one of those things that's, kind of hard to hide any other motive than, really targeting specific groups of people that are going to be very much limited because of that. Now, in addition to the limits on immigration, and again, keep in mind that all this is wrapped up in the context of the Red Scare and everything else. This is also going to lead in the United States in the 1920s a revival of the Ku Klux Klan. We're going to see the Ku Klux Klan reemerge in the 1920s. Bigger, national, and much larger, and larger not only in its size, but in its scope of who they were targeting in the 1920s. If you recall, the Ku Klux Klan first emerged, of course, in the South during Reconstruction as a means of undermining Reconstruction policy, as a means of undermining Reconstruction government, and that they targeted in the 1870s, 1880s. Who were they targeting? Who was the Ku Klux Klan trying to harass and intimidate and threaten? Certainly, mostly African Americans in the South, African Americans that were benefiting from Reconstruction. They were also after anybody that was supporting Reconstruction, but of course overwhelmingly African Americans, and it had the effect of largely creating that climate of fear and terrorism in the South to where Reconstruction was effectively undermined. But it comes back full swing in the 1920s, and this time it moves even out of the South and becomes a nationwide organization, having groups of people forming members and all over the country, in the North, all over. So it becomes far larger. Again, I've already mentioned several times that in the 1920s, we see this commitment, to preserving American values and preserving Anglo-Saxon culture and not wanting that to be polluted or corrupted by immigrants and radicals and all this sort of thing. And that gives rise to the Ku Klux Klan that was a more militant, group of mostly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants trying to, as they claim, defend those kinds of ideas, believing that America should be for white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, that white supremacy, that race needed to be preserved, protected, all those things they want to protect from, the pollution of immigrants and all those sorts of things. Now, also with the Ku Klux Klan being even larger and moving out of the South, they've also expanded by this point their targets, the groups of people that they are against, the people that they are trying to harass, threaten, intimidate, whatever. It's no longer just African Americans, so that's still part of their target base of people that they are trying to undermine and don't want to have influence, they don't want voting and all these sorts of things. But they're also expanding it now to, at this point, to include immigrants. Of course, any radicals, any anarchists or communists or people like that, people with, extreme political views. They are against Catholics. They are against Jews. Again, anyone that did not fit into that white Anglo-Saxon Protestant variety that they believe to be superior to all others. But their membership grows into the millions by the 1920s. Now, it does peak in the 1920s and then continues to decline from there. But this, again, an example of how this turning inward, trying to shun anything that was different, can take on quite an ugly tone throughout the 1920s. So we're going to see that revival of the Ku Klux Klan. Now, this is kind of switching gears just a little bit, but I want to talk about it for a second because it relates to really the next thing. One of the things we're going to talk about in the 1920s later this week is, which some of you are already familiar with, some of the cultural changes and particularly the role of women and new music and new forms of entertainment, all these sorts of things, more people living in the city, so forth, so on. So one of the cultural changes that starts to be kind of highlighted in the 1920s, people, start to realize there are distinctive cultures in, the South, African American culture, urban culture, and rural culture. In the urban areas, in the cities, people were far more likely to embrace some of the new changes, some of the new social norms, some of the things that were now socially acceptable. Whereas in rural areas, you were more likely to get people that saw that stuff as, a sign that everybody was just going to hell in a handbasket, So there's this definite division in religion between the, when you think about Protestantism, urban Protestantism and rural Protestantism. So there's this kind of divide going on in religious interpretation. One of those becomes called modernism. Modernism was largely followed, I don't know if you can really call this, you can't really call this a theology or a religious movement. It's sort of just a concept. But anyway, modernism is what you would call more of your urban Protestants, more city-dwelling Protestants. And for the most part, the modernists embraced a lot of those social changes. They're religious. This is part of a religious way of thinking. These are Protestant ministers that accepted those changes, accepted these new social norms, like, for example, the changing role of women, just accepted that as part of life. Life evolves and we just kind of go along. They were more likely to accept more scientific ideas that were challenging a lot of religious ideas at this time, particularly Charles Darwin, theory of evolution, those sorts of things. The modernists embraced a lot of that stuff and said, religion and Protestantism, all this sort of thing, can coexist with all of this. We can still believe in what we believe in and still embrace some of these changes. Well, as a reaction to that, then, of course, you get certainly more common in more rural areas, people that think that this is just absolutely horrible. And the reaction to that is something called fundamentalism. Now, fundamentalism fits more in line with some of this reactionary movement, reactionary politics and social things that we were just talking about with immigration and all of that. So fundamentalism it's a Protestant religious movement that rejects modernism and rejects these modern ideas and is very concerned about all these cultural changes that were taking place in the 1920s. Fundamentalists, it is often suggested that they believe in absolute literal interpretation of the Bible. I guess that's sort of kind of true. They certainly believed in a more literal interpretation than the modernists did. But they certainly believe in a more conservative approach, that things should be taken, if not literally, very, very seriously, and that the Bible was not flexible and that the Christianity was not flexible about certain things the way the modernists seem to think that it was. And the fundamentalists also, it's almost like, or rather it is, more about they're hostile to things that they don't believe in, hostile to things that they think are unchristian, and hostile to things that they think are wrong, rather than actually being united about a particular belief. So they are very much opposed to, some of this will make more sense in a couple of days, a lot of these social changes, like with women, wearing shorter skirts and dancing and drinking and jazz music and all this sort of stuff. They were horrified by all of this and saw this as a rejection of faith, that these things were destroying society, that all of this stuff just represented the moral degradation of society and was just, awful. And like I said, everybody was just going to hell for it. So there's this competing views of how all these changes should be interpreted, and that was causing rifts even within the Protestant community. Probably the best, what becomes certainly the most well-known example of fundamentalism in action, and this sort of almost like a cultural war going on between the fundamentalists and the modernists in the United States, has to do with something called the Scopes trial. The Scopes trial had to do with, it was a teacher, Scopes was a teacher, this was in Tennessee, who was arrested and charged because he taught the theory of evolution in his high school biology class. Tennessee had laws that you could not teach that. So here you see this controversy and this disagreement between your modernists that would say, hey, this is scientific theory, we should be looking into it, and fundamentalism, which obviously was far more prevalent in the South and in rural areas, this is in Tennessee, that rejected those kinds of things and saw that as practically criminal. So Scopes goes to trial for teaching evolution, and this becomes like this great big media frenzy and this great big sensationalized thing that everybody's tuning into. Again, we'll talk later, 1920s is the advent of the radio and the beginnings of mass media, so people are able to tune in what was going on in this trial. And all these big names, you might remember William Jennings Bryan. He's acting on the fundamentalist side. He's the lawyer, trying to charge or accusing that there was some kind of criminal thing going on here. The thing about the Scopes trial is this. Scopes is actually convicted. He's convicted of breaking the law, but he ends up getting off on some kind of a technicality, so he ends up not going to prison. But that's not exactly the point of it. It's what the Scopes trial kind of demonstrates, because in the end, William Jennings Bryan, although they do get a conviction, they end up looking rather, for lack of a better phrase, kind of silly, unable to really defend a lot of their ideas, and just seemed like a bunch of kind of religious zealots, like a bunch of religious maniacs trying to preach religion and biblical interpretations in a court of law, which didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So to a lot of people, the general consensus here was that modernism had triumphed over fundamentalism, and that it kind of made a fool of the fundamentalists and made a fool of William Jennings Bryan. This is like one of the last big things he does before his death. But it definitely shows it's not the end of fundamentalism for sure. We know that. Those of you who take biology have a little disclaimer, I think, at the beginning of your biology books to warn you that it teaches you evolution. So it didn't go anywhere around here for sure. But definitely showing these tensions between the social changes, or over the social changes that were taking place in the 1920s. Those that were embracing these changes and those that saw this as a sign of terrible things. All right. So we need to make sure that the Mensaco and Venzetti thing is turned in, and tomorrow we will finish up this section.